It's on the table also. Yes, yes, yes.
I invite you all to the first month, welcome you all to the first month of 2007. It's been a while. We have first started on this voyage, and I must say that it's been a very interesting voyage in the last 15 months. And today is a very unusual Manthan for us, because I will be welcoming Dr. Thomas, who is our first across the border visitor. Manthan, as most of you know, is a forum we started about 15 months ago, a forum for public discourse, and we've had some exhilarating debates in the last 15 months on a variety of topics. I'm sometimes surprised that we have not come to blows, but I hope that something like that will be achieved today evening. We invite debate, questions, and hope that a serious thought is lent to some of the aspects of life and of issues which affect us. And it will be a pleasure for us to work with people of rare intellect, as what Dr. Thomas is. Before we go ahead, may I request Dr. Suvarna to make an introduction of Dr. Thomas. Thanks.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Thomas Bak to you today. He is a neurologist from Cambridge with an interesting history. Born in Krakow, Poland, did his medical education in Switzerland, Germany, and his pursuit of research in cognitive neurology led him to travel to Cambridge, where he pursued a very brilliant academic career that was for more than the last 10 years, and produced some brilliant work on in understanding language problems in dementia and Parkinsonism. He's now moved to Edinburgh, where he is working in the School of Psychology, Cognition and Philosophy. So I think that kind of sums up his interests. And he is a master of so many European languages, and English, French, Italian, German, Spanish, in addition Portuguese and Turkish, and I'm sure Russian and a little bit of Japanese as well. And when I wrote up his introduction last week, I could claim that he had a working knowledge of Tamil and Sanskrit. I need to make an amendment to that. In the last 4 days, he's learned how to read Telugu as well. He asked me, why is it Sikandarabad in Hindi and Sikindarabad in Telugu? Well, and yes, he was a source of tremendous support to various students who came from all over the world to Cambridge in the cold, lonely climate. His house was a haven of comfort and intellectual, for wannabe intellectuals, it was a good place to be, where you heard all these people saying some very interesting intellectual things, and then you could pretend you were one of them. The Cambridge International Poetry Society was what he founded and was the president of for many years. My memories of him there was Thomas sing. I played a video of Wahida Rehman and Pyasa there, and I still remember Thomas imitating Wahida Rehman and singing Jaane Kya Tune Kahi in front of 10, 15 of us. So that was him. And then he was also the president of the Cambridge Central European Society, an avid interest in politics, understanding of politics of nations across the world, and also the Cambridge Crosstalk Society, where he organized some really excellent lectures by speakers of various fields, humanities and sciences. So So we're very happy to have you here, Thomas, today. And so over to Thomas.
1 minute before you start, may I request our original Kashmir watcher, Dr. Kaul, to give a bouquet to Dr. Thomas.
बैठ के बात करेंगे तुम उससे नीचे कर
Thank you. But I should say ये तो आपकी ज़र्रानवाज़ी है. Thank you very much for so kind words. I would say, I mean, a couple of months ago, as we were discussing with Suvarna the plans for my visit here, there was this idea that apart from giving maybe some talks in the department, which would be very much data-based, I could give a talk to a general audience on more general topics. And I felt very happy about it, because indeed, as Suvarna mentioned, one of my activities in Cambridge for the last, well, 5 or 6 years was to run you can hear well? Yeah. Was to run a so-called crosstalk society, which met, apparently like Manthan Society, roughly once a month, to discuss things coming from very, very different corners. So we had people from astrophysics to the study of Byzantine angels, and from politics to questions of religion. And then originally I thought to speak about something connected with science and modern society. And then Suvarna asked me, well, maybe you could speak to us about God. I have to say, as interesting the topic is, I felt slightly intimidated. And I thought, well, maybe I can try to speak something in this direction. And then she said, well, I mean, if you don't want to speak about God, maybe you can speak about India. So then I thought, how can I put together the issues of science, religion and India? Well, I hope, or I will try at least, to put them in some coherent argument. But I have to say that although it's a great pleasure to speak here, it's also a great challenge. In fact, it was in Hyderabad on 18th of February 1893 that Swami Vivekananda had his very first public speech before he went to Chicago to Parliament of Religions. So the place itself, and in fact his topic was my mission to the West. He came here after his pilgrimage from Himalaya to Kanyakumari. So in a way there is a quite, let us say, challenging big shadow from one of the big thinkers of India. But the topic itself that I've chosen, what Europe can learn from India, can sound presumptuous, and again there is a kind of giant throwing a shadow on it, and that is Max Müller, who was giving lecture series, in fact in my college in Cambridge, Corpus Christi College in 1882, with the topic, What India Can Teach Us. So I hope still that knowing the spirit of these both great thinkers, one Indian with a great knowledge of the West and one Western with great knowledge of India, I hope that it would be very much in their tradition, and they would be very happy to know that, I mean, their ideas 100 years later are not completely confined to Sanskrit scholars and theologians, but reached people working in so far disciplines as cognitive neuroscience. But as a point of departure from my talk, I would like to take a third talk or a third essay. And that is an essay by Anthony Quinton, an English philosopher, who in 1985, as he was president of Trinity College, Oxford, gave a talk at New York University entitled Religion and Science in Three Great Civilizations. And later, in '98, this talk was published in his essays from Woodhouse to Wittgenstein. And in his talk and in his essay, Quinton tries to compare the three great civilizations, which is China, India and Europe, and try to explain through this comparison why the natural sciences and technology were so successful in Europe, and so that, I mean, Europe managed to dominate both India and China, although both cultures started, in fact, in a way with a much more developed civilization. Now, first he makes points about China. And his idea about China is that the Chinese science, and like in fact Chinese religion, was always very practical in purpose and empirical in style. It's very much this-worldly, very much focused on the observable, and quite disinclined to go beyond that and look at some abstract rules that might govern the universe from behind. There are no big books of revelation in China, and their closest equivalent to holy scriptures would be rather a compilation of the sayings of the sages. He relates this to the political history of China being relatively isolated and stable, and although this can bring a lot of wealth, it also brought something which he would call a certain ossification of the society. Then he discusses India, which in his view is very opposite in many respects. So while Chinese science is extremely practical and empirical, in India the science and religion was abstract in the extreme, very much otherworldly. Well, he would say, using the word transcendental, if not philosophers would, or since Kant, would have used in a different meaning. And that's why, for instance, one of the most developed arts in India was always mathematics. And in fact, interestingly, I thought about it today as we were looking at the results of the neuropsychological testing with Suvarna. And one thing I found absolutely amazing was that while in Europe and on Guam, where I did some work last year as well, a lot of people with many years of schools have great problems with simple arithmetics. Indian people, illiterate people, seem to be absolutely brilliant doing a lot of mathematical calculations. So maybe this is not a stereotype, there might be really something true about it. But coming to Quinton's argument, he sees this tendency to see always the abstract and see the world all only as a maya, as a practically illusion, also related to Indian history, which in a way opposite to China was, I mean, for thousands of years dominated by constant invasions and constant impermanence, in fact, of power structures. Then after this he moves to Europe, and in his view the strengths of Europe come that in a way Europe managed to build a synthesis of both approaches. And this can be seen already in the antique thought in ancient Greece, where he would say that Plato would be in a way kind of more Indian philosopher in terms of looking for the ideas, for the abstract, while Aristoteles would be a more Chinese in style, very much contented to look at the observable things and systematize them. And this dualism was later built into the Christianity, in that the idea was that God, I mean, under the Greek influence on Christianity in the early centuries, maybe between 1st and 5th or 6th century AD, that theos was equal logos. So to learn about the nature was to learn about the God, and vice versa. And I mean, interestingly, I just want to add, I mean, we can come to it in discussion, that this was one of the points that the Pope Benedict XVI was trying to make in his Regensburg University discourse, which was later so much misunderstood and misquoted and practically focused on completely different issues. So practically he says that in fact in order to have a well-functioning science you need both. You need to look at observable things, you need to test to the experiments, but you also need some theories which go beyond the observable. And that, I mean, this combination of those things going hand in hand, so that then the theory can be then tested, improved, and in this kind of permanent dialogue between the observation and the theory, the scientific and then technological progress could move on. That's Quinton's points. I mean, there are several reasons why I very much like this talk, his essay. I mean, first is that it is one of the few attempts of European thinkers to try at least to understand non-European cultures. I'm afraid if you look at the majority of books about philosophy, about science and so on, they are generally simply confined to the Western world. And Quinton, I mean, may he be correct or not, makes at least an attempt to go beyond Europe. And in fact, I find it particularly interesting, and that is the point to which I will come at the very end of this talk, that he feels that learning about other civilizations can help us understanding our own. So in a way, he tries to explain the strength of Europe through comparison with other countries, to understand Europe through trying to understand China and India. And in fact, the talk was over 20 years ago. At that time, I think most people in the West didn't realize what they certainly realize now, that India and China are the two big powers of the coming century, or of this century. The second thing I like about the talk is that it recognizes the importance of the relationship between religion and science. I think it's a very important topic, and in fact, even in recent years, many very interesting books appear. One is the work of John Henry in Edinburgh about the kind of religious foundation of the scientific revolution. A very interesting essay by a Polish-Australian linguist about Anna Wierzbicka about the nature of evidence, in which she traces that the way in which we use the term evidence nowadays goes back, in fact, to the religious debates of 16th century and to the particularly English system of religious courts. So I think that this is a really important issue which very often has been neglected, because science was put in an opposition to religion. I mean, you just need to think about the recent book of Richard Dawkins about the God illusion. I think Dawkins is for me a very interesting example of a, well, I would say, I mean, he's a religious atheist, I mean, atheist missionary. And in fact, thinking about Dawkins, I have to think about, is it Ganta Asura, who was so hateful of Krishna that he wanted to have these bells not to hear his name. I would say that Richard Dawkins is so obsessed about his atheist missionary view that he is practically speaking about God all the time. But anyway, so that's the second point, which I think Quinton was very wise, to see the connection between science and religion. But the third point, which I like very much, is the idea that in fact a certain kind of equilibrium-based thinking, I would say, thinking that for a successful civilization, science, for anything successful, you need a balance of different elements. It's not just to having as much as possible of something which is good. It's having a combination of two elements, of two very often opposing attitudes. And what I would like to do is to apply exactly this idea of combination to what I think, after we spoke about the strengths of the European approach, is, I think, the very weakness, at least of the Western European approach, I would say, over the last 100 or 200 years. And in my view, one of the biggest weaknesses is that although the science has been extremely successful in terms of natural science and technology, it has completely let out of view the human nature. And this is something which, in fact, both, now I'm coming to the both patrons of my talk, Swami Vivekananda and Max Müller. Swami Vivekananda, in a discussion in Trivandrum, I mean, shortly before he went to Kanyakumari and then to Hyderabad, had a rather heated debate about the Western science with one of the learned people there who thought that India should simply embrace Western science full stop. And he said, well, and religion would be pure superstition. And he said, if religion has its superstitions, science has its superstitions too. Western science, for instance, has failed to cope with the question of human nature. And interestingly, Max Müller, I mean, this slightly longer quotation which I want to read to you, arrives about the same time at a very similar conclusion. He writes about Western society will all lead a fighting life. Our highest ideal of life is a fighting life. We work till we can work no longer and are proud like old horses to die in harness. We point with inward satisfaction to what we and our ancestors have achieved by hard work in founding a family or a business, a town or a state. We point to the marvels of what we call civilization, our splendid cities, our high roads and bridges, our ships, our railways, our telegraphs, our electric light, our pictures, our statues, music, theaters. We imagine we have made life on earth quite perfect. In some cases so perfect that we are almost sorry to leave it again. And then he asks, then why should we always fix our eyes on the present, one moment, this comes here, present only? Why should we always be racing, whether for wealth or for power or for fame? Why should we never rest and be thankful? Is it, and then he compares it to India, isn't, maybe we should think whether their philosophy of life is entirely wrong and ours entirely right? Whether this earth really was meant for work only, for with us, interestingly, pleasure also has been changed into work, for constant hurry and flurry, or whether we study Northern Aryans might not have been satisfied with a little less of work and a little less of so-called pleasure, but with a little more of thought and a little more of rest. And then he says about India, well, if I were asked under what sky the human mind has most fully developed some of its choicest gifts, has most deeply pondered on the greatest problems of life, and has found solutions to some of them which will deserve the attention even of those who have studied Plato and Kant, I should point to India. Now you might say this is really old stuff. It's over 100 years, it's a kind of romantic idealization of India, and in fact, it has no meaning for us today. Well, if you think so, I would like to turn your attention to the work of Daniel Kahneman, who as a cognitive psychologist won Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago. What is the great discovery of Kahneman? Well, he found out that human beings don't behave in a rational way as the economical theories were predicting. That you cannot really, according to the majority of economical theories, you should be able to predict human behavior absolutely clearly. Humans always will try to have more than they have, so basically they will always make a calculation and go always for the solution that brings them more. It doesn't really work. I think it's quite obvious that it doesn't work, but as Kahneman came to Cambridge, I was asking him, why does he think that, such an absurd idea was dominating Western economy for about 50, even 100 years? And he said, well, because it's a theory with which you can do very good models. And if you work at the university, it doesn't really matter if the theory has anything to do with truth. You just have to convince your colleagues and then you get your chair. So from this point of view, I would say that, it might come for many people, particularly in this country, as a surprise that, this insight can bring someone Nobel Prize. And Kahneman, in fact, moved further, and he's now particularly interested in what he calls science of happiness. And then he discovered also something incredibly interesting, with which he comes to give talks in Cambridge and Oxford and then Harvard, and that is that wealth and material well-being does not make people automatically happy. In fact, that if you look at what he calls external and internal predictors of happiness, the internals seem to predict much better the satisfaction with life than the external ones. Now, it comes as a great surprise to people in New York and London. But I think, you can ask in India almost any child who has been brought in Indian tradition, and he would say, so what? I knew that. So from this point of view, I think it's find very interesting, and I would, speaking about this idea of the Menschenbild, of the view, as the Germans would say, of the view of humans, I would like to discuss it in kind of three groups. First, what Kahneman would say the science of happiness. Second is how this Menschenbild interacts with science. And third is the idea of a guru, of a spiritual master. So let's come to the first one, to this Menschenbild, the science of happiness. Now, as I mentioned, Western civilization is built very strongly on the assumption that, in fact, in order to be happy, you just have to get as many as possible material things. And I think, just looking around, it's very clear and very easy to find that this doesn't work. As I say, there are people who really do empirical work on that, and with different scales and so on, you find this out. I must say, for me, a very, very important experience, which in a way showed it to me in an even stronger form, are my 10 years of experience in clinic of disorders of movement and cognition. A clinic which I have seen patients with severe neurological diseases, the vast majority of them untreatable, uncurable, who practically know that for years and years they will get worse and worse, they will get immobile, they will not be able to communicate, they will get wheelchair bound, and then they will die. And what I found always amazing is that in fact what for me was the best predictor of how despite this terrible situation they are still content with their life was not in fact their degree of impairment in terms of neurology. It was their attitude to life and the social support that they were having from their families. And again, if you say, well, that's kind of my romantic idea, there are now scientific papers published in best neurological journals showing, for instance, that in patients with motor neuron disease, their religiosity was a better predictor of life quality and, in fact, of survival rate, something objectively measurable, which of course in the West we like so much better than their neurological status at the first visit. So this is something which kind of West is discovering with our science, that maybe our view of the human nature was not necessarily so correct, and maybe we should at least have some balance between the external generators of happiness and the internal ones. But I would like to argue that this is not only important a question of, let us say, leading our lives or being happy or not. It's very important in the science. And I would say that the Western science is suffering from what I would call a permanent delusion of objectivity. It is a purpose of science to be objective, but to assume that because we have an ideal, we automatically have reached it, I think is rather foolish. And I would argue that what very often is forgotten in scientific theories is how much they are based on our personal biases, on our collective biases, on sometimes unconscious prejudices, and on political decisions. I mean, let me just give you a couple of examples. I mean, one is of course that in our kind of present dogmatic orthodox way of perpetrating science, we should have a hypothesis. Out of hypothesis we should divide experiment, and then it will either bring the hypothesis to fall or it will confirm it. But where do we take our hypothesis? We cannot check everything. We cannot have a hypothesis for everything. We are influenced by what we learn from our masters, but what we learn at school and so on. And very often people are not aware of the sources of influence. I mean, very rarely people ask themselves, why do we have this hypothesis? Is it just because some famous scientist in Boston said it? Why is it so popular? People, I think, are very often not conscious about their personal, the way the personal attitudes influence their attitude to science, also social influences. I mean, very often the science that will be funded is the science which, in a way, is very nicely in line with what the society is believing. And I find it, for instance, coming back to Richard Dawkins, I find it rather interesting that his book, The Selfish Gene, appeared exactly at the time as the Thatcherism became the, practically, I would say, state religion of the Tory party in Britain. And I think there is probably not, I would not see it as a complete coincidence. And one of the problems of this thinking that we are beyond, we are so objective, is also political thinking. Just a few days ago I read in The Hindu an interview with Neil Kinnock, who was in Delhi as a president of the British Council. And one of the things he said is, well, we are living in post-ideological age. I think we are living in one of the most ideological ages we ever had. But the sad thing is that people don't even realize how ideological they are. Non-ideological means that they assume their own ideology to be so self-evident that there is not even a reason to question it, and everything else is simply dark aberration and so on. I think this is a very, I mean, in a way I prefer someone who is, you know, for that matter, a convinced Naxalite, but know that he is so, rather to someone who believes to be completely impartial and non-ideological, but in fact carries a lot of ballast with him. And continuing with science, science is using a lot of metaphoric language, but again, scientists are very often not aware of it, and even less people who read popular science books. Since Descartes, practically, in La Métrie, the way we understand the brain is influenced by the machine metaphor. The idea that the brain is simply a machine, constructed machine. I mean, in 17th, 18th century, this machine was the most advanced one, which was the clock, the clockwork mechanism, and that's why Descartes compared brain to a clockwork. Then, let us say, 19th century, that would have been a steam engine, and now, of course, it's a computer. But, I mean, we make a lot of assumptions which are not necessarily true when we assume that our mind has to work in this way. Again, I think that science, I mean, if I give talks about, this is one of my favorite topics, about metaphors in science, but it says, oh, no, but I mean, you know, metaphor is something in the poetry. And then, you know, I like to go with them through different texts, and every 3 sentences you will find something which is extremely metaphorically used. And another aspect of this, I would say, is a complete overrating of technology. And we have, I mean, very often you read about something, well, this is a very sophisticated study because it used some sophisticated technology. Now, the study is as sophisticated as the scientists who conducted it. If you have extremely sophisticated methodology, but someone who doesn't understand the basic questions, the study will be incredibly simple. And I think very often our society makes the error of overvaluing it. And let me give you just one example, again from my area, neuroscience. Michael Gazzaniga is one of the most famous neuroscientists, and his book, Cognitive Neuroscience, is probably the most popular textbook. In chapter, I think, 3 or 4, in which he speaks about the methods, he gives an example how important technology is. Interesting is Introduction to Neuroimaging, one of the holy cows of modern science. And he writes that, as an example, that in 16th century, the scientists discovered telescope, and within few years after the invention of telescope, Galileo found that all the classical observations of a geocentric system were wrong, and practically had to revise it. So he gives us an example how a new technology has produced a new theory. Now, the only problem with this example is that it's painfully wrong by about 100 years. The heliocentric system, I mean, firstly, was already known to the Greeks. There was in Alexandria for many centuries, there was a big debate between the geocentric and heliocentric camp, and it just happened that the Ptolemy, who was a heliocentrist, was the most influential for the following period. But in the new period, it was Copernicus who described it, I mean, first in 1512, 1513, but he was so afraid of the importance of this discovery that he only published this 1548. Now, the telescope was discovered 1607 or 1608, and the Galileo's work was 1612, so it was like 2 generations later. So we have it exactly the opposite way around. We have something which comes from a theoretical development, which made people curious to look for some technology, and then this technology in fact confirmed what was found out through theory. So in a way I find it amazing that, as I say, in this that Gazzaniga didn't even notice that he was doing an enormous historical blunder with anybody with even a cursory knowledge of history of science knows. And I think the reason is because this dogma of technology being the most important thing, and technology always winning, is so strong that you can in fact say almost anything, people will believe you because it fits into this idea. And of course the other side of the cult of technology is, I would say, a denigration of the human aspect. In Western science nowadays, the human factor is practically nothing more as a mere impurity. And I think, apart from the fact that, as I try to show, we are fooling ourselves into being objective, we are also losing a lot of power and a lot of value, of very, very precious value that human factor can bring. If I think of my own intellectual biography, it is influenced more than, well, maybe apart from my parents, it is most influenced by my teachers, who brought me, by Professor Lachenmeier, who brought me into neurology, by Professor Waller's, who was my supervisor, and to an enormous extent by Professor John Hodges, who is also known to Suvarna. And it was not only his mental database which impressed me. It was not only his way of explaining things or understanding things, it was his whole personality, it was his whole attitude to life. It was his way of dealing with patients, of dealing with families. And I think that this is something incredibly valuable, and it tends to be completely forgotten. Now, the Indian term of guru is used in the West in an ironic term. Oh, guru means someone who, people admire or follow without any critical issue. I think I would wish that a lot more of our scientists would have the personality of John Hodges and would not be just interested in producing as many data, as many papers, forgetting completely the human aspect. So from me, I would say, in this term, guru is something positive. It is for me someone who is not only able to produce a lot of data, who is able to integrate this data into something, into his personality, into something which I would call wisdom. And that brings me exactly to the title of the talk, Data and Wisdom. I would say that for me there are maybe 5 levels of, I would say, information processing. The first would be data, then information, then knowledge, then understanding, and then wisdom. How would I say? Well, data is almost any bit of information that we have. Very kind of raw. Then you're putting it together into something meaningful, even fragmentary, would already make information out of data. But in order to make information into knowledge, we need to integrate it. We need to put it into some more, some connections. I mean, it's not just a list of single observations. And then we move to the next step, understanding, for which you need theories, for which you need explanations. It is interesting, I mean, as recently I was looking at the webpage of my own university. I should have done it maybe before I applied to get a job there. But the University of Edinburgh, which I found in fact quite positive in this case, say that it looks at its main mission, as enhancing knowledge and understanding. It was not producing data, it was enhancing knowledge and understanding. And then I would go one step further, and wisdom is for me when this data, when this information becomes really integrated into the personality. So it, in fact, exactly that what, let us say, the purist in the scientific field would find, this impurity. For me, this is not impurity, this is something most precious, which I always admired my teachers and which I would certainly aspire to myself. And now you can say, well, I mean, this wisdom is a very outdated concept again. I would say exactly the opposite. We are living in the time of an incredible explosion of data. And I'm speaking into a place which is not only the place where Swami Vivekananda had his first talk, it's one of the big centers of IT in India and probably on the way to become one of these big centers in the world. And I think one of the big problems, I would say the more data we have, the more wisdom we need, not the less. Because then it will become very, very difficult to deal. We need to be able to select information. And one thing which I find incredibly important and which is for me part of wisdom is to recognize relevance of information. This is something that data itself cannot do. And this is something that, in fact, you need wisdom for. So from this point of view, I would argue that wisdom becomes one of the most important things in the modern world. And far from being out of date, I think we should, in fact, think more and more how we could foster it, how we could strengthen it. I'm not saying, I'm coming back to this Quintonian idea of a balance, I'm not speaking against the data, not at all. I think the information technology was probably one of the biggest progress that we had in recent decades. But I think that the amount of data has to be combined with a certain amount of wisdom if it should make sense. And another aspect of wisdom, which I think, or at least for me, is a part of this idea of wisdom, is the tolerance. As the beautiful Sanskrit saying says, vidya dadati vinaya. I think that understanding things make us much more aware that our point of view cannot be the only one in the world. For me, wisdom and intolerance are two things which simply don't go together. I cannot imagine someone I would perceive as wise who at the same time would be convinced to have the only truth and assuming that everybody else is wrong. So from this point of view, I think with data you can just have fights, who has more data, who has more convincing data. With wisdom you will have the attempt to understand the position of someone else. So from this point of view, we have the issues of the overwhelming data that we have nowadays. We have the issue of relevance, we have the issue of tolerance. So I would say that for me, the idea of wisdom should very much be brought back again and put very, very high on the agenda. But I mean, is wisdom something specifically Eastern? Well, I think that in the West we had quite a lot of thoughts which are very similar to what was expressed over centuries, over millennia in India, but it happened to be a little bit forgotten over the last 100 or 200 years. And that's what why for the end I would like to give you or tell you a short story which many of you might know. I think it is part of the Tales from 1001 Night, but I think it appears in many other collections as well. And that is a story of a man in Cordova and a man in Isfahan. There was a man in Cordova who had several times a dream that far away in the Persian city of Isfahan there is a mosque, and next to the mosque there is a fig tree, and under this fig tree there is a big treasure being hidden. So he decided to go on this journey, went through many countries, through many seas, and reached the city of Isfahan. And there he has seen the mosque, which looked exactly like in his dreams. He's seen this tree, but hardly was he near there as he was taken away by servants of the man who had the property, beaten up and brought in front of the owner, and because they saw that he was a thief. So then the owner asked, "So why were you trying to be here?" And he said, "You know, I had a dream that in the city of Isfahan, under this fig tree, there is a treasure." And then he said, "Oh, you fool, I had 3 times a dream that in the city of Cordova, next to the mosque, under a palm tree, there is a treasure. But I would never be so fool as to go there." Now this man goes back from Isfahan to Cordova and discovers under the palm tree in his very garden a big treasure. I very much like the story because it shows for me what is for me the essence of traveling and the essence of looking at other cultures. It can allow us to get a much broader perspective of what is there in the world, but it can also help us very much to understand ourselves. And in fact, the Orient in general, and India in particular, I would claim were incredibly important for the self-definition of the Western culture for many, many years. Many centuries, or millennia I would say. Max Müller reminds us that the very word orientation, which is used in almost any European language, comes from Orient. Orientation was to find your Orient. So in a way, I think we understand ourselves better when we put our civilization in relationship to the Eastern ones. And that's why I think that looking at India can help us understanding maybe this now little bit forgotten trace of wisdom. And I mean, if you look at the Stoic theories or Seneca in ancient Greece or Rome, you will find that many of those thoughts will be very similar to those in classical Indian thinking. But I mean, that's for Europe. But what I ask myself as well, and that's a question with which I would like to finish, is that all the Indians, particularly young Indians nowadays, who are very fascinated by Western civilization, who travel a lot, who understand a lot about the West, I hope very much that they will learn to understand the West, to appreciate the strengths of the West. But what I also hope at the same time is that this knowledge of the West can help us, or help them to go back to their country and discover the rich treasures that are buried under their very own soil. Thank you very much.
That was most interesting. That was the most interesting thought, chain of thoughts that we had. The field is yours. Yeah.
Hello,
Yes.
I'm Anita. I would like to know your views on 2 things. One
Yes.
is your differentiation between, or do you differentiate between the brain and the mind? And your views on Dr. Brian Wee's book on Many Masters and Many Lives. I mean, how do you see it?
Well, I mean, can you repeat which book you mean?
Many Masters, Many Lives. Many Lives, Many Masters. Dr. Brian Wees.
Dr. Brian Wees.
W-E-I-S-S.
Weiss. Brian Weiss. Well, I mean, firstly, I mean, I'm afraid, I mean, I heard about the book, I haven't read it, so, and I very much, I mean, I really don't like to speak about things I know just a little bit because it's very dangerous. In fact, one of the things which I always teach my students, and I mean, it was one of the examples we did today in the talk, that it's very dangerous to judge scientific papers by reading abstracts, because very often the text of the book is exactly the opposite, or the paper, what is said in the abstract. So I would be very cautious of, you know, judging something which I don't know enough. Now the question with brain and mind, I would still see myself very agnostic in many of those questions. And I think that is, I would say my scientific credo is what we had recently in Edinburgh, a big debate about the question of enlightenment. And if enlightenment can come in, you know, come again, something like enlightenment 21st century. And one of the issues was, of course, you know, science. And the professor of geology in Edinburgh said that, I mean, there is a big difference in understanding of science between the scientists and the general public. The general public believes that science is about certainty. The scientists believe that science is about uncertainty. And I would say that I think that I found many answers to my questions of my scientific work, but I found many more new questions I start asking myself. And that's why I would say that in some ways I maybe feel even less sure about the issues of mind and brain than I felt before I went into neuroscience. And I would be very cautious about, I mean, let's see, you know, you have this, I mean, what I certainly would not like to go is the path of reductionism. And I think and in a way, I mean, I mentioned the neuroimaging as the holy cow of modern science. I think there is a very dangerous tendency in neuroimaging that people believe because they find some process somewhere in the brain, that is the nature of its process. I mean, the fact that you localize something doesn't tell you about the nature of it. I mean, the fact that we are now here in Hyderabad does not tell exactly what we are. I mean, let us say there is much, it can tell us something about it, but it doesn't tell us everything. And I think there is a danger of these reductions, which I would certainly be very, very cautious of.
Do you see a difference between the Oriental God and the Western God?
Well, the God. Well, I mean, that's, you know, that is in fact one of my favorite questions, and I would say it depends a little bit which Oriental and which Western gods you have. I mean,
okay, let's get to India.
Well, no, I mean, I would even say, I had in fact, it was today, I think, a rather interesting discussion, or no, yesterday. I come from a very Catholic country. I mean, the country which brought, well, in fact, I would say, I mean, my father was Polish, so from a country which brought the John Paul II, and my mother was German, from the country which brought Benedict XVI. So in a way, on both sides of my family, I come from kind of Pope-producing countries. So I would say I am very Catholic in my way of thinking. And in many respects, I find Hinduism more similar to Catholicism than Protestantism is. I mean, this might sound very surprising, but I would distinguish between two things. I would distinguish between the kind of official religious credo and between the way how religion is practiced. And I think one of the essence for me of Catholicism is that it has an enormous breadth of approaches. You can have very emotional religion, which practically, I mean, very often if you go to villages in southern Poland, it would be very much like pilgrimage, it would be very much like Bhakti movement in India. I mean, the holy pictures and, I mean, the ceremonies are in some way so similar to puja that you would be surprised. And then you will find, I mean, you can move all the scale up to a very abstract theories, very often, for instance, represented by Jesuits, which would have a lot in common with, let us say, the Advaitist sort of Vedanta. So in a way, for me, I would say I feel very much at home in the world of Hinduism in terms how religiosity is perceived, how it is generally thought of. And then again, in Hinduism, you would say you have a tendency, I mean, as no, it was said in Vedas, and the point I think Swami Vivekananda often made is that there's one God, but the sage or wise men call him by different names. Now in Catholicism you have something different. You have in a way something which is theoretically a monotheism, but then you have a Holy Trinity, and you have Virgin Mary, you have a saints. So in a way I would say that both religions almost meet kind of in middle field, and the saints are for us not kind of different gods. It's like aspects, so to say, of the same whole. Now, Protestantism for me is very different in that it has an incredibly strong, I mean, it's more like Islam in some ways, I would say, where you have the Holy Scripture and nothing else. So from this point of view, I would really make a difference between just the theological doctrine and the way how religion is practiced. And in this respect, I feel surprisingly at home in Hinduism. Can I just add one thing, because it's quite important, sorry I've forgotten. I think there's also one important kind of issue of morality where Hinduism is more similar to Catholicism, and that is, in Catholicism very much we believe that they are the acts of people which practically determine their afterlife, if they were good deeds or bad deeds. And this is, I would say, quite close to the doctrine of Dharma. In the majority of Protestant theology, and that was one of the main issues of the confrontation between Luther and the Catholic Church, was that Luther's doctrine said it's the sola fide, it's the faith alone which decides, not the deeds. So again, I would say that the Catholic doctrine is much closer to Hindu Dharma than to sola fide of Luther.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Madam. This country is one denominator which is changing very substantially, the economic denominator.
Yes.
Other denominators remaining the way they were.
Yeah.
And this denominator is disturbing all other denominators. Culture, education, entertainment, religion. Now from today, next 20 years, where do you see we are headed, India as a society? Are we going to be more parochial? Are we going to be more secular? Are we going to be more spiritual? Are we going to be more materialistic? Where do you see it?
Knowing India, I would say in all the directions you mentioned. I remember before I came from, yeah.
What he probably also wants to add is what India should learn from India.
Yeah, I mean, but that's why I wanted to finish with the story, and I love this story about the man in Cordoba and Isfahan. I think I find it very important to learn other points of view, but sometimes it can bring us back to our own treasures. But, I mean, coming to your question, I would say in all directions a bit. And I remember before I first came to India, I mean, my very good Indian friend Rajesh Joshi, who, well, at that time was the correspondent for national issues for Outlook, now he works for BBC in London, said, well, you will find in India everything that you love and everything that you hate. And I think this is very true. I mean, I don't know any country which would be so rich and where you find really practically everything. Now, the question I find is extremely interesting. And the issue is, to what extent is it possible to embrace the industrialization, Western technology and so on, without necessarily adopting all the aspects of the Western way of life, including those that you recognize are negative. And a very interesting kind of case study for me is Japan. I mean, Japan is maybe next to India the non-European country about I know most, to which I traveled many times. And what I find fascinating about Japan is that although it is certainly, I mean, undoubtedly one of the most developed countries in the world in terms of technology and so on, it is not in any way an imitation of the West. I mean, the country is remarkably different. I mean, of course they have some kind of, you might find the men wearing, not wearing yukatas but wearing ties and so on, but in the way of thinking, the way of being, in their social structure and so on, they are incredibly different from Western society. And also, for instance, in a very banal example, in their diet. you know, if I compare just say with Guam, on which I did some work as well, I mean, in Guam they practically embraced completely the American food, and you can see practically from the 45, I mean, the people who are 70, 80 are incredibly healthy. People who are now 50, 60, I mean, they have diabetes, they have hypertension, they have severe obesity, and so on. It's really like you can see those who kind of had their childhood after 45 are among the most unhealthy people I've seen anywhere on earth. Those above are among the most healthy I've seen anywhere on earth. And thus, you know, living in the same families next to each other. And this did not happen in Japan. Japanese food is completely Japanese. And I mean, you might have some Western places, and you know, the great advantage that they have is they have the longest life expectancy on earth. So, you know, they manage, you know, to have a, let us say, the most modern technology of producing food, but it doesn't mean that they live on hamburgers. I mean, otherwise the life expectancy will probably drop by 20 years, you know, within the shortest time. So I think that it is possible. I mean, of course, there are certain effects of industrialization which are difficult to avoid, and I think one of the big problems for India will be the kind of disintegration of family, which is called by industrialization. But, I mean, you don't have to go all the way of the Western world. I mean, one of the things I found interesting at the conference I was before in Madurai was the question of speaking about dementia and about the effects that dementia has on you know, in different societies. And this is something which I noticed in India, which I noticed, for instance, in Guam. Patients with the same level of cognitive disability are still well integrated in India, living quite happy lives and quite, I mean, being part of the system, while in Europe they are somewhere in the corner, in a nursing home, considered to be completely useless, treated, you know, well in terms of material life, but very badly in terms of, you know, psychological life, and very often, I mean, severely depressed and being stuffed with a lot of antidepressants so that they keep quiet. So in a way, I mean, that is one of the things which I think would be very sad for India to lose. So I hope that India will reach some kind of compromise and not throw you know, aboard all of its traditional values.
Good evening, sir. When you see a small child from the perspective of a child, when a child is born, he cannot walk, just keeps crawling, and after some time, you know, he just tries to walk, just scrambles, and once he learns to walk, he never forgets, you know, he never falls again. You see this kind of natural development. You see this kind of natural development which takes place in a human being. And see the present kind of situation in this world. Once again, coming to human being only, the tremendous capability of human mind to adapt. It adapts to the situations in a blink of second, very fastly. I can visualize the entire sky in a movement, and next moment I can visualize the sky will become a mountain, the mountain becomes a river, the river becomes a fish, the fish becomes a small stone. So this process of tremendous flexibility of human mind, and you see human soul, human heart, it's exactly the opposite of it. You asked me to become angry, and angry now, in next moment you ask me to become happy. You ask me to dance out of happiness next moment. So it's so difficult, you know, unless I do it artificially, it looks so bad. So the world is changing so fast today. So there's two kinds of technological balances I can speak about rather in that sense. The outer technology and the inner technology. And when you speak that we should strike a balance, probably India should strike a balance. When the wheel of this globalization has been set free, when the wheel of these changes has been set free, is this balance possible? Now, will the business around me, will the world around me give me that time to, you know, develop in a natural way and get that balance out?
I would say, yeah, I mean, I think there are always kind of two dangers looking at the you know, development, and I think we had both of them very well personalized in the last hundreds of years in Europe. One is the kind of blind idea that progress is always good. and that everything new, everything is great. And I mean, that is something which I think, you know, in a way I would say probably became like a state ideology of US, and it's very strong in many European countries as well. This idea, you know, new is always good. But on the other hand, you can have this extreme, let us say, what for instance in Europe would be represented by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the idea that, you know, progress just brings us away, that we, in fact we devolve into worse stages, we are getting more brute and so on. So in a way that would be the two extreme positions. I always try, I think it became hopefully clear from, you know, many points I made in this talk, I always like to look at things in a balanced manner, and I think every time we win, we lose, and we should always be aware of that. I mean, let us say the change from nomadic life to agriculture, I mean, it's fact. I mean, it has. I mean, we are now in a place which is called Nomad Hills, as far as I know, and yet this is one of the kind of poshest areas of Hyderabad. So we have now a very nice, you know, a very nice way of seeing it. So most people would say agriculture was great, but in fact, agriculture also costed us a lot of freedom. I mean, being able, and it produced enormous. I mean, in a way, in nomadic society, you don't have slavery usually. Well, it became very, so in a way it was a win, but it was a win with some risks. If you see it something which I would say, you know, having gone to Saraswati Temple on the 1st of January as one of the biggest achievements of humanity, the writing, well, but writing in a way killed off a lot of oral culture. I mean, particularly in India, if you think that some of the greatest works of Indian literature were practically, composed in mind and given from generation to generation, I mean the kind of Shruti tradition. If you think that in fact the first really great linguistic work of Panini was practically rather, you know, conceived and hold in memory rather than written down, I think we are losing something as well. So I think we should always look that, I mean, we win something, we lose something, and then try to find a balance. And then you are absolutely right that, I mean, we cannot live completely against the stream, but I think we don't have to follow the stream completely neither. It's maybe a little like with sailing. I mean, it's difficult to sail against the wind, but if you know a little bit how you sail, you can at least do very much something like this. And for instance, I mean, just a very banal example that I gave you, no one really forces us, for instance, to change our dietary habits to those that we know are incredibly unhealthy. I mean, you know, anybody opening any book of medicine knows that, I mean, there is practically nothing worse in the world than Anglo-Saxon diet in terms of, you know, health. I mean, you are not forced to have it. You can make your choice. I think you can make your choice very much also how you design your family life and so on and so on. We cannot change everything, but let us say, out of the feeling that we cannot change everything, we should not commit the error not to change nothing. I mean, there is a nice quotation of Edmund Burke, who said that no man has ever made a bigger error that gave up to change anything because he realized that he cannot change everything. And I very much subscribe to this.
What is... how? Go ahead, after you.
No, I was suggesting, I mean, one of the thought I'm getting is that I was suggesting that the development of technology or the impact of technology is actually counterproductive to the development of the human mind.
No, not at all. I think it can be incredibly, I mean, let me just give you an example. I'm very interested in history. Now, I would say that development of technology makes history much more accessible. Now, I mean, for instance, there are a lot of historical works which are maybe present in one copy. I mean, one of the things I'm interested in, Giambattista Vico, Italian philosopher of 17th century and 18th century. And then, I mean, there are some works that are maybe present one only in a library of University of Naples. If I want to study it, I would have to go to Naples. Now, all these things are screened on the web. So I think, you know, it can help us a lot. What I just mean is that we should be aware that the more information we have, the more careful we should be in selecting them. Again, this is something I would say very self-evident in Indian tradition, as the nice Sanskrit shloka says, how was it, Kasya nasti swayam brigna, shastram tasya karotikim. So who doesn't have common sense will not make any benefit from books. And I would say, who doesn't have common sense will not have any benefit from technology.
Do we find any relationship, maybe it's an English language wording, knowledge and wisdom?
Well, I would say yes. I mean, you have, I think in most languages you will have words that correspond to knowledge and that corresponds to wisdom. I mean, in fact, the Sanskrit vidya is one of the old Indo-European words, and in fact the word for vidya in Polish is wiedza. So you can see, you can discover this root in many languages also in Europe. And I would think, I mean, again, I would have to ask someone like Anna Wierzbicka, who has enormous knowledge of, across different languages. But I guess that most languages will have distinctions between, let us say, data and between knowledge and the way how you use it. And I would very much warn against a tendency, which, well, I don't think you have to warn in India about it, because I think one of the things I love about India is its incredibly multilingual character. And I mean, if I think, how many languages people speak here every day, I mean, you will have someone speaking Telugu here, Tamil there, Urdu there. I think people are aware probably in India about it. I think the problem of the Western world, particularly US, that it became so monolingual, it assumes that the world is like English language is, and that all other languages are inferior. And I mean, just to give you an example, many languages have a system of evidentials. So for instance, in Turkish, if you say that something happened in the past, you have to use either the form, which means that you were witness to this, and or a construction that means that you infer it from something you have seen. I mean, he must have come, as opposed to he came. Now, in fact, the languages that have the most complex system of evidentials are spoken by small Indian groups in Amazons, where you have 4 or 5 ways of distinguishing. So depending if you have seen something, you have heard something, you inferred something, or you believe something. I think this shows to me that there is a lot of wisdom in those people, that they realize that there are different sources of knowledge and you have to attach different importance depending on how you have learned it. So I would say that this is something which is common, I think, to all human societies. And as I say, I would very much want to, think of kind of advanced societies and primitive ones, because at least looking at the language, very often those that we think primitive has linguistic systems which are much more complex than ours.
You've talked of the Indian traditions, the Indian philosophy, the Indian culture, and the Indian religions. How do you synthesize or relate these with each other?
Oh, I mean, again,
primarily the religion part and the philosophy.
I think that the border between religion and philosophy is a very artificial one. I mean, a lot of things which we would call philosophy, you would call religion in India. And I mean, if you look, for instance, and I think, one of the wonderful books on this topic, Radhakrishnan's Indian Philosophy, I mean, you will find there is, about the Vedic world, there is the days of Bhagavad Gita, and so on and so on. And I mean, if you look, I think the distinction is somewhat artificial, and as I say, if you look at early Christianity, you will find the same. I mean, if you look at the period of the 4th, 5th, 6th century, I mean, there were a lot of, the ideas of God and the ideas of knowing the nature were exactly connected. And I think that one of the big, and I think Indians are probably very well aware of that. I mean, that, for instance, one of the things in India, religion defines often what you wear, how you behave, which party you elect, which food you eat, and so on. So I presume, I don't know, you can tell me I'm wrong, but I would presume that most people in India are very aware of the influence that religion has beyond the immediate. In Europe, I would say it is the same, but people are unconscious of it. Again, I think in Europe we are incredibly good in self-deception. I would say, let's look, just 3 days ago, 2 countries joined the European Union, Romania and Bulgaria. It was a very, very long process, and before practically 1st of January, the eastern border of the European Union was exactly the border between Eastern and Western Christianity in 11th century. You had practically all the, on one hand, all the Catholic and Protestant countries, there was only one Orthodox country within the European Union, and there was only one, namely Greece, and there was only one Catholic nation outside the European Union, namely Croatia. So in a way you see, most people don't say, but and why were there so many objections in Romania and Bulgaria? I think many people didn't realize, but there is a feeling that they are culturally different because they belong to Christianity, but to the Orthodox part. Now let's look at the European Union. There were big referenda about the European Constitution. Now if you look at the referendum result in Netherlands, there was about 60% against, 44. If you look at the map of Netherlands and you look at the religious map of the Catholic and Protestant areas, it is practically exactly the same map as the map of yes and no for referendum. So I think that religion plays an enormous role in our lives and our politics and so on, but the problem is we don't realize that. We are assuming that we are incredibly secular in Europe. But I mean, look now, for instance, at this enormous issue of burqa. I mean, it's, you know, about the scarf in France and so on. I think we are assuming in Europe to be secular, but it's a complete self-deception. Religion lives, even if you are not religious in terms of, you know, practicing it, our way of thinking is very, very different of it. I think in Europe, as much as in India, but I guess in India people know about it, in Europe most people don't.
Thomas, it's very nice to hear your sentiments about India. I know you love India. But there's one thing which worries us sometimes, is that there's also some inherent weakness in our civilization. If you look at it, in the last 1,000 years, particularly have not been very good for India. I mean, not a major discovery. Like, I mean, everything has happened in West. I mean, if we look at here,
Yeah.
the electricity which we have, the public address system which we have, the shirts which we are wearing, everything that we have is basically borrowed from the idea and the science developed in the West.
Yeah.
So what do we have other than wisdom? Now, I'm only hoping that probably it's a wheel of civilization, and in the next 500, many people think that India is going to become a superpower in the next 200 years. I hope that happens, although I often have a discussion with my wife on this and we debate often whether that will happen or not. But I would want to know from you that do you see some weaknesses also, some inherent fragility in our civilization?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I don't think that, you know, I think it became obvious to everybody in the audience that I'm very fascinated by India. I think it has a lot of very valuable, precious treasures that, you know, I am very keen to discover. But I don't think that it means that I idealize it. And the reason why I started, in fact, with this essay by Anthony Quinton is because it shows, I think, the kind of inherent weaknesses of both the Indian and the Chinese approach. I do think that, I mean, with all the beauty of, you know, Vedanta, I think that India has neglected the empirical side. I mean, in a way, if you think that everything in Maya doesn't really matter, you know, Sarvam Brahma Mayam, well, then you don't really need to, you know, look and discover things and so on and so on. But I think that still this, let us say, I mean, a lot of Indian assumptions are still, can be integrated with religion. So let us say, even, I mean, if you, in Indian system, the gods are still part of the system. They are not really completely arbitrary. They are not just deciding because I feel today like this, I do it. I mean, they are, in a way, part of set rules. I mean, and that's why I think that, you know, you can still combine it, and you know, even this abstract thing, I mean, brought, for instance, enormous development of mathematics. I mean, India was the first country, I think, that developed mathematics. I mean, what we called in the West Arabic numbers are in fact Indian numbers that were brought by Arabs to Europe. So in a way, and that's a very good example. I think Indians were not particularly good in selling their own products. I think it's probably not by chance that it were the Arabs that brought the Indian numbers to Europe, and that's why we call them Arabic numbers, not Indian numbers. And I presume most Europeans don't even know that originally they come from India. So from this point of view, I think you can integrate those things with a little bit more, let us say, interest for empirical observation, but on the other hand, building on the strengths, for instance, like mathematics.
A little on the neurology. Does this excessive viewing of TV or computer by children under 10 influence their brain in a different way with regard to their remembering power or concentration and things like that?
Well, I would say, well, I have to give kind of an answer in two parts. I don't think that there is really good kind of empirical work on that. And it's very difficult to have an empirical work because I mean, let us say, to do an experimental study you would need to have, let us say, 200 children, and then you put, 100 children for the next, 5 years watching TV all the time, and the other 100 children, doing something else. It's difficult to conduct. But I would say, let's say, I try now to be very much, this kind of Western evidence-based scientist. What we know, in fact, from studies from rats is that and in rats you can do it very easily. You can get 100 rats or 200 rats, in fact, with the same genetic material, and you put 100 of them in an environment where they have very little, let's say, things that they can interact with, and 100 of rats in a cage where they have a lot of things where they can play, where they can move, where they have to discover things and so on. And this has been done. And what you see is that if you compare these rats after, let's say, several months, you will find differences even in the structure of the brain. They will have a much larger, they will not only be better behaviorally, they will have a larger hippocampus. So from this point of view, I would say, even if I don't have the evidence of children, I would still think that having variety of stimuli and having a chance to interact with the stimuli, I would be very surprised if it would not be beneficial. And having just a kind of passive consumption of material, I would be very surprised if it would not be deleterious.
If I'm not mistaken, there's a survey done by Pediatric Association of America, confirming that it definitely affects the children who are excessively watching this. They have done a survey on...
Well, the problem is, I realize about this well, but the problem is, you don't know what is the beginning, what is the end. So in fact, there is no question that, you have studies showing that children watch TV, but you don't know, is it because they watch TV, or is it because they have little activity, and they, because of that, they simply sit around, and those children who are much more active, maybe more intelligent, will be more inclined to do other things. Can I just give you a very paradoxical example? I know from studies conducted in Africa, they were looking in a group of children, looking at were interested in the effects of infestation with worms and intelligence. And they found an incredibly surprising results. The children infested with worms were more intelligent. And there was a big debate, how can it be? It's unlikely that the worms are so good for you. But then they were looking at the patterns of behavior. And the children which were more intelligent were more explorative. They went around, they were doing things and so on. And they had simply much bigger risk to get infected than the children which were kind of sitting at home all the time and didn't explore. So in fact, probably it was exactly the other way around. I don't think that the worms made them intelligent. It was that they were just much more active, which made them also much more exposed to the environmental dangers that they had. And that's why I think that's the great difficulty in doing this kind of correlative studies, because we cannot control what the reason is. I think there was just a point about this.
Yes, I think there have been some experiments done on humans.
Yes.
On humans. Members of the audience here who are more than 40 years old were not exposed to TV. And I think we are the rats who were sedentary.
Dr. Bak, I was wondering that you mentioned about tangible, observable treasures and the hidden treasures in India. Isn't that a factor of age? A youngster who is attracted to Western culture wants more immediate, tangible, observable treasures immediately, and they will keep on getting attracted to West till we find an alternative here. Old-timers like us will keep on going towards the Vedanta, Bhakti and Gita, and that's what I guess is happening in West, that more and more old-timers are thinking yoga and the other things are the best. So isn't that a process of age rather than imposing on youngsters anything else at this stage of the game?
I'm not that surprised. I think that in this case I beg to differ. I think that I would see it in a way probably the kind of very Indian idea of rather the kind of the wheel turning. I think, if you think, for instance, at the, movements of the 60s and 70s, it was the younger generation that was incredibly frustrated with the pure materialism of their parents, and, went on, and, you might find that, many of them completely idealized India, had unrealistic ideas, and, went, to study their gurus. But in fact, it was exactly the kind of opposition movement to their parents. So I don't think, I would rather see it as a kind of going around, the cycle of going around between generations. The generation which lost everything in the war was very much a generation who was, trying to stick to every material thing they had. So the next generation was the one who was extremely frustrated with that, was trying to break out. The generation thereafter is becoming again very, very materialistic. I presume that now the next generation will probably again react against it. So I see it much more as a cycle rather than normal development. And I think, the point I'm trying to make is that if we speak about, this, Vedanta or whatever, it's not about just, ascesis and so on. It's about being happy. And I think, if you assume that people like to be happy, maybe they can learn that they can get more satisfaction sometimes from their own attitude than just from having their external wishes fulfilled. I think that, parents can still make it clear. So there are 2 points. Firstly, I think it's rather a cycle than a linear development, and second, I think there is still some margin for explaining these things.
Yeah.
Doctor, you spoke about wisdom.
Yes.
With respect to wisdom, do you find any society or any... Right. With respect to wisdom, in your experience, have you found any set of people that are perhaps more wise collectively, so to speak, than any other? Because if you're saying that wisdom leads to tolerance, greater tolerance, etc.,
yes,
and it's perhaps the highest in your path from data moving upwards, then isn't that something that we should all, aspire for? And if any community or a set of people collectively have actually been in that state, or have reached that state?
Well, I think that all human societies are remarkably heterogeneous, and some more, some less. So I would say Japan is relatively homogeneous. India is extremely heterogeneous. So I would be surprised to say that Indians are wise or Indians are unwise. What I would say, for instance, from my personal experience, is if I think of Indian scientists that I have met in Cambridge, and unfortunately, Cambridge has been quite a for many years a center where a lot of Indians go to do their PhDs and so on. I would say that practically in all of them that I know and that became my friends, that they have I would say, more wiser attitude to the knowledge than a lot of my Western friends. So I do think that if you manage to combine this attitude, and another thing which I find very interesting is, again, if I think of my friends who were in Cambridge, and some of them are still in Cambridge, it's not that they would be idealizing everything Western. They are very well aware of Western weaknesses, and they are very aware of their own traditions. And I think that, for me, being rooted in your own tradition and being open to others is not an opposition, it's exactly opposite. They are two aspects of the same coin. I think that a lot of intolerance is built by threat. People feel threatened through the others, and they feel threatened because they don't feel very much rooted in their own tradition themselves. And that's why I would think that, or at least the Indian friends that I have, I think are much more aware of their own traditions than a lot of Western friends.
So with respect to that, you're saying that perhaps Indians or the learned people from India are perhaps wiser, but isn't that a consequence also of greater knowledge, greater understanding? A person like you, for example, also, is it fair to demarcate a certain country, a certain civilization with respect to that?
No, that's why I started it with a preamble that I think the individual differences are probably much bigger than the differences between countries. But what I would say, I would say, for instance, about myself, that I was raised in a tradition which was very much about knowledge and understanding. That was how my parents brought me up, and I am deeply grateful for that. I mean, I think that Poland nowadays is extremely different from the Poland I grew up in. I think it's probably now got much more extreme into kind of worship of everything materialist and everything coming from America than, you know, probably any other country in the world. So from this point of view, I'm very glad for the background that I had. So I think it's very complex because it depends not only from the country people come from, it depends from which, let's say, part of society they come from, and it depends very much in which time they grew up. So that's why, as I say, I gave it only as an example, but I think there are a lot of variables which influence that.
In your talk, Dr. Bak, you made references to Richard Dawkins' God delusion 3 or 4 times. What exactly are your views on what he has to say? Well, it's a very interesting book that he has written.
Well, I think he has a big problem. I don't know what went wrong in his childhood, but I think, I mean, I think he's really a case for a psychoanalyst. I mean, I heard him speak in Cambridge, and I mean, he spent practically a whole talk speaking about the dangers of astrology and how unscientific it is to look at horoscopes and so on and so on. Now, if you look, I mean, what is the biggest, I mean, and he was speaking to an academic audience, Cambridge University. Now, if any of them are interested in astrology, I mean, maybe they might, you know, on a weekend read a horoscope out of fun. I don't think that any of those people would really be very much, would make, you know, scientific decisions based on astrology and so on. Now, if someone feels so incredible, I mean, I'm coming exactly to what I said now about being rooted and being threatened. I mean, someone who has such a missionary zeal to destroy everything, which is not exactly in his view, cannot be sure of his own roots. I mean, someone who, I mean, I have friends who are atheists and they're happy with that, but they don't feel that they have to convert everybody who's religious into atheism. So I would say, I mean, someone who has this incredible deep, I mean, in a way, and I know many religious people from many religions who, you know, will be very far away from this kind of conversion mania. I would say this conversion mania for me is a sign that people are extremely weak in themselves, that they are probably afraid of their own maybe kind of religious, you know, desires, and then trying to overcompensate it through this missionary zeal.
Doctor, the topic you've chosen for today
is
what Europe and the West can learn from India.
Yeah.
Now, I would like to turn the question around
Yeah.
and go back to what India can learn from the West.
Yeah.
Now, you started off mentioning that the Indian society is extremely heterogeneous.
Yeah.
Whereas the Chinese is very homogeneous, and Europe kind of amalgamated the two and got the benefit from it.
Yeah.
Now, I believe that could be a very big weakness in us, that there's nothing wrong in driving either on the left of the road or on the right of the road, but if one person decides to do one and the other one, then we're going to have chaos, and I believe that's probably where we're going wrong. So if I were to ask your views on what we need to learn from the West in terms of more homogeneity, so that we have a common goal for taking us forward, what would your views be on that?
Well, I mean, there is, I mean, probably many of you know the kind of rather nice and amusing book by Pushpan Singh, We Indians. And one of the points he is making is that India is all about individuals. And, I mean, Indians work very well in families, but they don't work very well in teams. And I think that is a big problem. And I would say, I mean, in a way, you can learn, you know, all about the weaknesses of India just looking at the traffic in this country. And I had, you know, I was speaking with Suvarna about yesterday. I think the traffic in Hyderabad is not, I mean, the goal of the traffic is not to get from point A to point B. It is to make to you clear some fundamental truths about the world and about human behavior. And so from this point of view, it's really, I mean, you know, having traveled little in Hyderabad, I mean, helped me more in understanding the world than anything else. And, you know, one of the points, for instance, yesterday, we were going through a street, and then there was a big lorry parked in the middle of the street, but I mean more on the left side. Now, there were cars coming from this side, and we had to go there. Now, because the cars that were coming from the other side were not letting any cars coming in, they produced, of course, a traffic jam and the roundabout, so they couldn't get further either. So at the end, I would call it selfless egoism. Because the point is, I understand being egoistic if you can get some advantage out of it. But in this case, you are egoistic even if you cut yourself in your own flesh. I mean, even if this will cost you half an hour of waiting, you will not go 3 meters back, let the other go through, and then the whole problem would be solved. I think I'm not trying. I mean, if I give one advice is, I wouldn't say try to be altruistic, but try to be kind of maybe more rationally egoistic and think that sometimes, waiting a bit will be in your own advantage. And I think, in a way you can see this pattern, when you try to buy a ticket in the office and all people are pushing from different directions. So after you buy the ticket, you cannot leave because people don't let you. So for the next 5 minutes, no one else can buy a ticket because you are not allowed to. And I think these points are, as I say, it's not about altruism, it's about, I would say, better coordinated egoism.
Thomas, last time I went to Calcutta, and I was advised by my local host, the doctor called, please don't follow traffic rules, otherwise you will meet an accident.
No, but the point is, of course, I'm not saying about traffic rules, I'm saying about Swayam Brigma. I mean, if you don't let the other get out, you will not get there.
I just wanted to say what an American, when he was watching the traffic in Delhi, said. He said, I was looking at this traffic initially with this idea that, this is chaos. And then after some time I realized that no, it was not that chaotic because nobody was banging against each other. And it was like fish in a shoal, a lot of ants around where you don't bang into each other. It's like an organized chaos. Everybody knows what the next driver is thinking. And so you know where to go. He said, if I had to drive, I would be mad. But I could see the Indians were making good out of it. And they were not, scratching each other, and everybody knew.
I mean, this is amazing, and I'm bringing you to the second thing which I realized yesterday. Again, I took a lot of lessons from traffic here, and that is the power of self or auto-organization or auto-regulation and the dangers of having half order. Namely, the worst traffic jams were at the places where police was trying to control the traffic. This was really hopeless. I mean, when you have some kind of auto-regulation, at some point, people will get through and then you have it. But once the police start doing it, it's completely lost. So I think, having a half order can be, you're absolutely right, can be sometimes more dangerous than, having a complete auto-regulated chaos. So I agree with that. But as I say, I think in many respects, this kind of, let's say, pushing forward is not always the best way of getting forward. And I think that is really something and this goes further, for instance, in teamwork. I think, many people in the West, it's not that they are very altruistic, they realize that, if we get our strengths together, we will both be better than if we do it alone. So it's, as I say, it's not from altruism, it's from an insight that cooperation sometimes leads to really good results. But again, it's difficult to say, maybe this, because in India you had this kind of small societies living side by side, almost separate lives, there was not this idea of having society as a whole. The Indian society was a family, and then maybe was the group, the religious group, the caste, whatever. So it has a lot of advantages because then you can live side by side without killing each other, which was unfortunately very often the case in Europe. But it has a disadvantage of not having this feeling of having something really communal.
I would also like to just make a small point on the homogeneity and heterogeneity. When I was in the West, I was amazed there's so much of homogeneity, but I thought that was sort of bringing down the civilization because in America they had these parents who were very much against the school when they wanted to get Spanish into the school. And I think me coming from Kashmir and learning Telugu here, it's been so enriching to know many more languages, 4, 5, 6 languages, and you get so much enriched by all the cultures than having just one language or one homogeneous way of working or thinking or a single because this has been debated in our country again and again whether we should have a uniform civil code, everybody should be same and the same thing.
Yeah, it's an extremely important question, and in a way I would say that you have in the Western and the Eastern world two kind of types of models. So Indian model for me is the model which builds on, as you say, unity in diversity. Chinese model is very much a model which builds on suppression of everything, which doesn't conform to the rule. And I would say in the Western world, the European model is very much about diversity. The American model is very much about the unity. And from this point of view, again, I would say I feel much more at home in India than I feel in the US. I mean, the idea of having, one language, one culture, everything kind of built on homogeneity. I think it's a potentially dangerous idea, and it has extreme, risk of slipping into intolerance, into arrogance, into feelings of, one's own superiority and imposing one's model on the world. And that's exactly what we see now, in a manner which I think is threatening. I mean, basically, the world to an enormous degree. And now, in Europe, we have the question of European integration. In some way, I would say that, India could be, in some respects, a model for European Union, in that we want to have more integration in terms of economy and so on, but we still want to practically, preserve our cultural and linguistic richness.
Good evening. Sir, I would like to ask, what is the role of sacred scriptures in India? Now, because you have read so much of Vedas, particularly if I stress, one of the verses, many of the verses of Vedas say that Brahma is imageless, formless, there's no picture. But when we see the practice, it is totally different. And the source of this practice is a philosophy which says that at lower levels of faith, you need an idol. And once you reach the higher levels of faith, there's formless.
Yeah.
So what is the role of holy scriptures in a common Indian's life?
Well, I think that the big problem, let's say, of answering anything about Hinduism is that I think you can probably find whatever you say, you can always find something in the Holy Scriptures which will confirm it and something which will refute it. And because the problem is that, unlike Christianity and Islam and a certain degree Buddhism, there is no kind of one single script. You have the Vedas, you have the Upanishads, you have then, Bhagavad Gita, you have Manusmriti, and in many respects, they contradict each other, or at least they can be very interpreted in different manner. So I think there is much less unity in the scriptures, and in a way, I would say, with many things, it can be seen as a weakness, it can be seen as a strength, that's why I think it's very difficult to say anything about the Hinduism without, someone coming, yes, but, Manusmriti has this, says this and that. So I think that's, but in a way, it helped also, I think, very much Hinduism survive. If you look at in history, and particularly the big threat imposed by, let us say, or the competition from Jainism and Buddhism, it was very much a kind of auto-regeneration of Hinduism by, pitting different parts of this tradition. So it is a different attitude. What you say about images, I find it very interesting, because in a way I think that most religions, I think almost all religions I know, will agree that the ultimate goal is to have something which is not an idol, to have something abstract. I think that you will find that, practically across these all big religions that I know. I think the difference is that some religions would say it is so important that we have to have all people doing it, while others would say, well, some people maybe cannot get without it, so it's a kind of phase. The idea would be to be reached, to have this kind of idol-less abstract worship, but we don't assume that everybody will get there, so we are happy if those people who kind of develop most in the spirituality will get there. But I think the idea is probably common to all religions I'm aware of.
In the context of heterogeneous arguments, what is your view on homeopathy?
Oh, homeopathy? Well, I would say I don't understand enough of it to really make a judgment. I was brought up, let us say, in the tradition of academic Western academic medicine, and in Western academic medicine it's very difficult to. It's not the homeopathy is not part of it. I have, I would say, on one hand, I have my problems with this idea of similia similibus, of treating the same with the same. So it's not a principle which for me is immediately kind of clear, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. So I think it's something which I would withhold my judgment. What I think is probably true, as the Homer to say, is that it's very difficult to find something, an answer to every person, because you always have to treat the very person as it is. And in fact, just today we're seeing a patient with Parkinson's disease. Something which is, bread and butter for, medics, across the world, one of the most common neurological diseases. And in fact, one of the great truths about Parkinson's disease is that you have to titrate every single patient, depending on, for instance, even such things, what time they got up, what time they will go to bed, what is their cycle. You have really to find something very, very specific for each patient. And I think that is the problem that Western, let's say, the evidence-based medicine has, because it assumes a homogeneity of groups, which is not given. So from this point, I think that, there is a lot of valuable things in homeopathy. It's not a method that I would be enough, let us say, knowledgeable about to make, any pronouncements.
I think, coming back to her question.
Yes.
She said that Brahma is imageless and the low level of believers' image is needed.
Yeah.
I think we have a hierarchy of loyalty,
yeah.
hierarchy of morality.
Yeah.
One example of that is in Mahabharata,
yeah.
where if it is sunset, both the parties would say,
it's
on.
Difficult.
Both the parties would say that stop fight, we can now meet, talk, morning we come back again and start war. Same parties one day agree to take the woman, and the other party disrobes her. Morality, sunset, no war is fine. Morality here is thrown to the winds. Are you getting it? Contradiction, yeah.
Of course, to which, as...
how would you do that?
Well,
yeah, here at sunset, you abide by the rules of the war.
Yeah.
And on some other day, you put the woman on stake, other party disrobes her.
Yeah.
Because you lose the bet.
Yeah. But I think it's music to my ears, because I would say it's exactly the argument I was trying to make. That there is enormous amount of contradictory examples. If you mention Mahabharata, as Vyasa said to the Pandavas, no man is entirely bad and no man is entirely good. Everything has its good and bad sides, and even the best man will do something wrong. Sometimes the worst man will do something good. What at the end is decisive is the balance of that. But I think the question here was rather about the images, and I would say that certainly if you consider, let us say, Advaita as probably the kind of philosophically most, and I'm following Radhakrishna's assumptions, not my own obviously, then I think in Advaita we have very much the kind of worship of the unity rather than worship of the idols. So from this point of view, I would still say that if you compare this kind of different approaches, as I say, following Radhakrishna's approach, I would still think that there is a certain ideal of a abstract worship in Hinduism, but it is practically a small group that reaches it.
Yeah, I would say that if you separate God, religion and social custom, you will have an answer.
Yeah.
Because you can say that religion explains God, but God exists without religion. So the philosophy problem comes because we try to mix social custom, religion and God in one bucket.
Yes.
But separate the gods, separate from religion, separate from social custom, because God exists.
Yeah.
Now, how we interpret it is what is different. But the existence of God is not dependent on religion.
Yes, but the way how we, independent of the question of the existence of the nature of God, religion was the human nature, that's with it. And that's why I think it's very, in a way, we are human where we worship God. And that means that all the complexities of human nature will necessarily form part of the religion.
I will go to the extent that little further extended. I would not say when dog has a God, because it's not because of human existence. God exists.
Yes.
So because we don't know that, but how a dog perceives that, therefore we say human perceives God, whereas therefore we say that if you're not human, there's no God. It goes beyond my philosophical thought that God exists. So therefore you cannot put that human knowledge as a conception of God and say therefore that if somebody had a different knowledge, God will not exist. It says that you have to believe that God exists. Now it's an interpretation how a fish will interpret God, or we don't know enough about it today, or a dog interprets God, and a human interprets God, and some other planet, a super intelligent being will interpret God in a different way. But if you say that at ultimate source is, there has to be an unanswerable point in quest for knowledge, which would mean that there is a point where you cannot go beyond. That is what is God. Okay, so if you put that way, then you have to separate God, religion and social customs in separate bucket. It's practical to combine all for existence, but it's not necessary.
You see, I mean, that's the very reason why I didn't like to speak about God. I said that I would like to speak about religion, science and society.
There's a question here. There's a question here.
Do you believe in God?
Pardon?
Do you believe in God?
Well, I would say mostly yes, but I would certainly, I would describe myself as someone who doubts, but if you have doubts, let's say, if you have doubts, it means that there is something there that doesn't leave you quite happy with the idea that it's not there.
So, or is it just a concept that man has invented? Because of the uncertainty of life.
Well, I mean that would be, of course, the general way that atheists would argue. But I would describe myself. I mean, let us say if I would have to put myself between, decide if I'm more on the side of religion or more on the side of atheism, I would certainly not describe myself as an atheist.
Yeah, but keeping aside religion.
Yes.
I mean, this is just purely spiritual.
Yes.
About speaking about spirituality in its purest sense.
Yes.
Essence. Do you believe in the concept of God, the existence of God?
I mean, in terms of something beyond what we perceive and understand, I would say yes. But I mean, the very nature of it means that this is, by definition, something beyond our understanding.
That's what even the Vedas also say.
Well, I mean, that's why, I find a lot of things, in particular in Upanishads and the Vedanta philosophy, which is in a way quite close to my way of thinking. I mean, there is a reason why I felt this affinity to this approach.
We'll take one last question.
Yeah.
Sir, people have been believing in God for so many years, from thousands of years in different cultures. Do you think that this is a need of human brain or human thoughts in believing someone superior to him, like someone ideal being? Is it a need of human brain?
I think it is, and I think that, or let us say it is, one of the very interesting questions that goes again and again, and in fact, for instance, this term, I had to teach about animal behavior, which is not quite, till now I was working mainly with, with diseases in humans, so it was a new topic. So I did a lot of reading, and there's a big debate, to what extent can you speak about animal intelligence, what is really the difference between humans and animals. And, the more you think about it, the more you kind of start getting insecure, you realize that there's a lot of social cognition in animals, that there is a lot of, it could be even theory of mind in animals, that there are quite complex mode of communication, which are not like our language, but which can be quite complex, and at the end we don't really understand how they work. So what is for me the kind of the specifically human? And I would say one of the most important things is always looking for something beyond ourselves. Being aware of our own limits and having this desire to go beyond the limits. Now you can call it religion, you can call it philosophy, but I think this is something which, I would say if you discover something which is common across practically all human cultures that were ever described, I would assume that this is something which is very deeply ingrained in human nature. And such things are language, such things is interestingly music. That's again one of the questions that always puzzles me. I don't think there's any human culture ever described by anthropologists which wouldn't have music. And one of those things is religion. So I would say this shows to me rather clearly that there is a very, very deep need in humans for that. And I think that we can doubt about religion, but I definitely believe that science is not particularly well suited to replace it.
I think that was a wonderful note to close this meeting on. Vikram expected that we might come to blows in this meeting. That did not happen. But what happened was an extremely engaging, very, very, very interesting talk by Dr. Thomas Bak with us. I don't think we have had such a fine talk for a long time, and I must say we are extremely thankful to you, Dr. Thomas, for having come and talk to us on something as interesting as this. We also have with us Ms. Blanca, who has come with Dr. Thomas and has been touring India. Thanks for being here again with us. We hope you will come again to India. We hope you will have some more Manthan with us, and we look forward to spending some more time with you. Thank you once again. Friends, two things. This is a month where we have two meetings. On 10th of January, we have a meeting jointly with Secunderabad Club and Moving Images, where we have Dr. Rashna Gandhi Imhalsi, a noted psychologist from Delhi, who's speaking to us on Bollywood and the psychology of love. Bollywood and the psychology of love. She's done good amount of study. She's a very articulate speaker. And I think that talk would be of immense interest to all of us. For that talk, we don't meet here. We meet at the Secunderabad Club, 10th of January. You'll get a mail from us over the next few days, perhaps tomorrow or day after tomorrow. Do make it a point to come. It would be a very interesting subject, and she has done a lot of study on how Bollywood treats love, and it would be of immense interest. Look forward to having you there. A friend of ours is actively involved in making eye donations more accepted practice in the society. He's published these calendars, and he's been good enough to give one to each one of us for circulation, hoping that eye donations will become more popular amongst all of us. As a matter of gratitude to Dr. Thomas for having come and spent the time with us, we'd like to offer him a small memento. Can I ask Ram Mohan, our regular videographer, to offer this on our behalf to him? Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thanks, friends. We meet again on 10th January. Thank you. Secunderabad Club. Secunderabad Club.
Within 15 minutes, तुम तैयार हो जाओ। तैयार हो, लकी को भी तैयार करो।
He is my brother.
इनको पुट कर दो वापस।
Hello.
अरे बिल्कुल यार, कैसा नहीं ऑन नहीं रहेगा।
Happy journey, Ram.
Thank you.
Enjoy your RRC.
Do you have a number, sir?